Okay, hi. Hi Sylvia. Hope you're doing well. I'm gonna talk to you through this video about my midterm project, what I've been working on in Florence, and then obviously since I left. So here we go. So obviously we were tasked with rebranding a theater, and the theater that I was assigned was the Opera House in Florence, so the Maggio Musicale. And our task was to create a new identity system for the theater. So on this slide, I just have some images of what the original identity for the theater looks like. So obviously, you can see there's an illustration of the actual building with this kind of slab serif typeface, and they use a red color with the fleur de lis symbol. And then I just took a screenshot here of their current website, which is kind of all over the place. They're using, again, this slab serif typeface in italics. They're using this gold color, and they're using the illustration of the building. So this is the original color palette. They use this kind of muted red, which kind of reads as like a pink salmon color, and then they're using this gold color which looks a little bit brown, and they are obviously using black. So I think some of the main concerns with the original identity are that I really don't like the use of the fleur de lis symbol to represent Florence. I think it's a little bit cheesy, and not the best to look at. I'm not a fan of the typeface. I think it's a little bit aggressive. The really chunky slab serif I think is a little much for the identity. And there's not a lot of cohesion, so they use different naming systems, they use different colors, they use, different treatments to the illustrations and the type all over the place. So I think it's just lacking cohesion, which is what I'm trying to bring to this identity. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my research into the theater and into what I want to change about the identity. So here are just some historical references. I found some really cool vintage posters from the theater, so from the Maggio Musicale. What I really liked about these posters were that they're really simple and that they get the message across. And they use the simple naming system, just Maggio Musicale Fiorentino, which is what I decided to go for in my rebrand. So that was the naming system that I chose to use to make everything a little bit simpler. But I also really liked, especially in the poster on the right, this kind of surrealist, like Dada vibe. I don't know if it would work today necessarily, but I just think these posters are really cool. And on this slide, I just put some images of similar organizations, similar opera houses in the world and their logos. So obviously we have the Met, the Royal Opera House, the LA Opera, the National Opera of Paris, and a few others. Some of them with more successful brands and identities than others. I know we spoke about the Opera Saint Etienne. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but I know we spoke about that one in class, and that was a big inspiration to my project and just got me thinking. And then on this slide, I just put some other various visual research that I thought was interesting for various different reasons. I loved looking at these old posters. So this Aida poster on the top left, I thought was really cool the way they treated the type. This really like extended horizontal type. And then I just have some other posters from the Met. I have a picture of the outside of the Florence Opera House because I really love the exterior. I also have this Japanese woodblock print because in a class I was learning about, we learned about these woodblock prints that they made for theaters and that depicted actors. So I just thought that was cool, and I was looking at that during my research. And then just again, some other imagery. And then on this slide, I have a link to a website where I have basically all of my visual research for this project. So now I'm going to talk about my initial concepts for the rebrand, my 3 main ideas that I was kind of exploring through this semester. I didn't go through with all of them, but I'm just going to speak about each of them a little bit. So the first idea that I kind of experimented with was this idea of old versus new. And this is kind of the inspiration for where I took it visually. But just to speak about the idea a little bit, the idea of old versus new comes from the idea of Florence being kind of like a historic city with a lot of importance, obviously from the Renaissance and Italian history. And then this kind of new building, the Opera House, is fairly new, and obviously the architecture is really different from anything in the city of Florence, so there's this really strong contrast of old versus new. So as you can see in these photos on this slide, I was looking at, on the left, some of the type in the churches in Florence, this really interesting black letter that was like a mosaic in the floor. And then the middle image, I was looking at ways that black letter type was combined with sans serif, like this obvious kind of contrast between old and new. And then on the right, I was looking at just like shapes that black letter type makes, and if I could kind of abstract that in some way. So the way I executed this idea was just kind of trying to abstract this black letter, idea. And these were kind of the 3 sketches I had. I think they're kind of interesting. I love the middle idea, but I got some feedback that it wasn't really reading like an M. It was reading more like an N. So it wasn't really working. But my second idea for the rebrand was to focus on the architecture of the building. As I mentioned before, the architecture of the Opera House is really different from anything you really see in Florence. It's really grand, it's big, it's not in the city center, it's kind of removed from the city center, so that adds to it as well. And then for the actual architecture of the building, what my group found really interesting was that the exterior is very hard and angular, while the inside theater is actually very round. So there is this contrast between the harsh exterior and then this really round, circular inside. So you can see that in these photos here. On the left is a picture of the outside, and then the other 2 photos show the inside of the actual theater. So you can see that shape, which is really interesting. And this is how I executed that idea. So I was looking at the idea of like angular versus curved. And I was looking at how you can kind of use the shapes in a different way to create different illustrations or pictures, kind of. So the middle idea uses the same shape in different ways to kind of create different logos, which I thought was cool. And moving on to my third idea, which is the idea that I believe is the strongest, which is the one I iterated on the most, is this idea of like repetition and the influence of music. So obviously I'm rebranding an opera house. Music is really important to that. So when looking at a picture of sheet music, I was really inspired by this like repetition, and this like high and low kind of aspect. And then I was also inspired by the branding for the opera ballet Vlaanderen. I don't know if I can pronounce that either, but I think we also looked at this in class, and I really loved that it was really dynamic and showed movement. So I was trying to think about how I can create that in my identity system. And then I was also really inspired by these like Dada posters, like the one I showed earlier in the presentation. I just thought they're really cool, and like a lot of them use this idea of repetition, so I wanted to incorporate that somehow. So These are some of the ways that I executed that idea of repetition. And this is the logo that I ended up using. And in this slide are basically the two main ways that I'm going to use the logo. So on the left, this circular kind of icon is a way to reduce the idea on the right. So I love this idea of the repeating M's because I kind of like the way that it looks visually, like the M and the M next to each other. I thought that was really cool, so I wanted to emphasize that because I think the name of the theater is really interesting, the Maggio Musicale. So in these two logos, I'm really emphasizing the double M. So yeah. And as for the color palette, I'm obviously still going to use black because you need that. But I didn't have that many issues with the original color palette, but I'm adding a teal color, this like bluish green, to kind of make it more contemporary and just add another level to play with. Because I think using red, gold, and black is a little bit harsh together, but when you add in this teal color, it just brings another element to kind of help the identity. So in this slide, I'm just showing 3 different iterations of the logo using the 3 new colors. And I'm just going to run through some mock-ups. So in this slide, I have 3 different posters showing, an opera. And I'm using the idea of this repetition of the M's to kind of create a pattern through the posters, and also framing like the supplemental imagery. So yeah. And in this slide, it's just another iteration of a poster with a little bit more information and a little bit more of an experimental layout, which I think could be really cool. In this slide, I just have a mock-up of a tote bag. Could be cute for the museum shop or the theater shop, obviously. Another iteration, I think using the double M like creates a lot of room to play and to make a lot of things visually, because you can create a pattern out of it. In this slide, I have a mock-up of a ticket, just something really simple that you can use for any show, any, dance, opera, or orchestra that comes into the theater, versatile ticket mock-up. Here in this slide, I just have some banner kind of mock-ups. Maybe this could be outside of the theater, or there's a park surrounding the theater, so these banners could be obviously outside in the world. And then for my final mock-up, I have just a sample social media mock-up, so an Instagram layout. And I think I really like this contrast between the contemporary, like, new logo that I created with these, like, more classical Italian imagery. So obviously paintings and, photography and the idea of opera. So I think that even though the new logo is really contemporary and using like a sans serif typeface, I think that it plays really well off of, typical imagery, and I love that contrast. So yeah, and in this slide, I just have my contact information for where you should send the feedback, obviously. And thank you. I'm really excited to hear what you think about my work this semester, and I can't wait to finish this project. So thank you.